I'm so pleased to be speaking to you again, but it's a little strange not to be seeing you in person at St. George's. Also, I have to say I had been meaning to get this together much sooner, but somehow changing to remote teaching has been taking up much more energy and time than I had anticipated. Now, of course, I don't need to remind anyone that we're trying to engage in this Great Decisions program virtually because of the coronavirus pandemic. But I think it might be good to just think about what this pandemic actually quite vividly illustrates. And basically what this points to is that noted primatologist Jane Goodall, in a May 2020 interview, she says that there are various behaviors that are responsible for the outbreak of pandemics in general and the current one in particular. In fact, she points to very specific economic behaviors that would have to change in order for us to be able to effectively tackle the challenge of pandemics. Indeed, I would say our social distancing experience has really highlighted our overall vulnerabilities, and we are learning so much about these uneven effects of the virus across different populations that this really seems to highlight this interconnected nature of various issues facing the world. If we are to find lasting solutions, Jane Goodall explains, then we must focus on the interconnected aspects of today's challenges. And that means we must be more than mindful of the following.
Right now, we're facing a man-made disaster of global scale. Our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change.
This was environmentalist David Attenborough speaking in 2018 at the UN's Climate Summit in Poland. I know this is not a new topic. Researchers have warned of the devastating consequences of climate change for decades. But whether because of our inability to see more than one crisis at a time, whether because of our inability to adjust to change quickly, or our inability to even see our own responsibility, too many of us still don't see or don't want to see what is right in front of us. So I would like us to start with just a quick examination of what this climate change actually is. Now, in short, of course, climate change refers to multiple, simultaneously occurring and mutually reinforcing and even exacerbating phenomena, such as, of course, rising temperatures. Now, average global surface temperature has risen by about 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1850. If emission rates for greenhouse gases continue on their current track, models indicate that the globe will be between 4.3 to 11.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer by the end of the century than it was in 1990. And of course, we also have to consider the fact that sea levels are rising. Warmer temperatures not only cause glaciers and land ice to melt, thus adding more volume to oceans, but they also cause seawater to expand in volume as it warms. Now, under a business-as-usual greenhouse gas emission scenario, models indicate that sea levels could rise 2 feet or more by the end of the century, again compared to 1990 levels. In addition, we have to think about the acidification of oceans. Much of the carbon dioxide emitted by human activity has actually already been taken up by the ocean, thus actually moderating the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. However, as carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it forms carbonic acid, acidifying the ocean. And this acidification will likely cause serious harm to marine organisms such as corals, lobsters, sea urchins, and others. And then, of course, we have to consider just the effect on water cycles. The seasonal rhythms of streams and rivers have changed as winter precipitation falls much more increasingly as rain instead of snow, and as earlier spring temperatures cause snow in the mountains to melt earlier and faster. Warmer temperatures also mean higher evaporation rates and thirstier plants and people, increasing demands for water. Projections indicate that on average, dry areas will tend to get drier and wet areas will tend to get wetter. Now, the issue of water cycle changes is actually a very powerful example that really illustrates this interconnected nature of problems I mentioned earlier. Because if we look at an issue that is easily recognizable as exacerbated by climate change, we can really see this quite vividly. And that, of course, is water scarcity. We can see from this map how water scarcity is a global risk, but it is one that is heavily concentrated in certain regions. Now, one consequence of this is that if we consider the fact that under normal, or I should say current conditions, already 842,000 people die every year from a lack of safe drinking water and inadequate sanitation and hygiene. Now, let's put this in context of climate change. And we know that projections indicate that on average, as I said earlier, dry areas will tend to get drier, which will then be exacerbating water scarcity. And we can see how quickly the estimates of people dying actually increase. The UN estimates that between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year from things like malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress, all brought on because of a lack of access to safe water. Now, let's add to this the current health crisis, where, of course, the global recommendation is to frequently wash your hands under running water. But 3 billion people across the world do not have access to safe water at home. And that obviously is going to complicate their ability to frequently wash their hands. And if they can't do that, then their exposure to illness will increase, which will put further stress on already weak health systems, and so on and so on. So this then easily shows this interconnected nature of complex issues around the world, and it also demonstrates the enormous effect climate change has. In fact, the director of the Columbia Water Center, Manu Lal, explains, and I quote, that most of the climate change impacts come down to water. When people talk about climate change affecting agricultural output, sea level rise, wildfires, and extreme weather, they're all essentially a water story, says Lal. In fact, much of what I use for the next few slides comes directly from the research conducted at Columbia University's Earth Institute. So let's look at this more closely and maybe even a bit closer to home. And of course, what happens in the world in terms of climate change affecting the water cycle, of course, also happens in the US. Here too, we can see drier regions become drier. Warmer air can hold more moisture than cool air, and as a result, in a warmer world, the air will suck up more water from oceans, from lakes, soil, and plants. The drier conditions this air leaves behind could negatively affect drinking water supplies and, of course, agriculture. Indeed, we're already seeing some repercussions of this, whether we're thinking about the horrific stories from 2018, where, for example, in South Africa, specifically in Cape Town, there were enormous water shortages, or whether we're thinking more closer to home, where 2018 also saw stories of droughts across Texas. Now, while of course some of those droughts are not new, their frequency, their intensity and spread across more regions of the US has been brought about by multiple facts. There are, of course, population density issues, more intense agriculture, etc. But these have also been further exacerbated by the warming climate. And what you see here is a map of the US indicating that the area of the US affected by the 2018 drought had trebled in size from just a year earlier. Likewise, the warmer, wetter air could also endanger human lives in other ways. A study out of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory found that higher humidity will make future higher temperatures unbearable in some places. As the air warms, holding more water, but then when the air is already saturated, it can't hold much extra water. So even though we're still sweating, the air isn't allowing the sweat to evaporate as quickly. That's when our body temperatures start to warm to dangerous levels. This image is actually from a 2019 Washington Post story reporting on exactly this scientific study. When all that extra warm, extra wet air cools down, it drops extra rain or snow to the ground. Thus, a warmer world means we get hit with heavier rain and snowstorms. The northeastern US is so far seeing the largest increase in the intensity and frequency of heavy precipitation events. And in the central US, clusters of thunderstorms have been becoming more frequent and dropping more precipitation since 1979. Now, what we see on this map is how precipitation is changing in the US. The colors on the map show annual total precipitation changes for the period from 1991 to 2012 as compared to the 1901 to 1960 average, and it shows wetter conditions in most areas. Moreover, data is available that can show exactly what kind of stresses are inflicted on our water availability. Based on a systematic study of satellite data collected by NASA's Earth Observing Mission, led to the creation of this map. And here you see data that's quantifying the rates at which all regions on Earth are gaining or losing water. And what the study found was that the world's high latitude regions, including the northern half of the US, as well as the global tropics, the low latitudes, they're getting wetter. Simultaneously, the mid-latitudes, the arid to semi-arid belt sandwiched in between, are actually getting drier. And against this backdrop, the map is dotted with numerous hotspots, places where rapidly increasing, and these are the deeper blue spots, or rapidly decreasing amounts of water, and these are the deeper red spots, pose major threats to human and environmental well-being in a variety of ways. If we just zoom into North America, we can see that there are critical spots, both in terms of too dry and too wet areas, affecting water security and, of course, the related issue of food security in the United States. So, where does this leave us? Well, changes in precipitation patterns will challenge many farmers as well as natural ecosystems. Scientists at Columbia University's International Research Institute for Climate and Society are creating tools and strategies to help farmers adapt to these challenges. Natural ecosystems, however, may not be able to adapt as quickly. Indeed, the picture, as Greta Thunberg reminds us, is rather bleak.
My message is that we'll be watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
It is indeed quite depressing to think about how little the international community's efforts have been in addressing something that has been known for quite some time. Moreover, the current COVID-19 pandemic has made it even harder to think about even these limited efforts. For example, over the last few decades, multiple agreements have sought to address the dual imperative to focus on emissions reductions while staying mindful of the need for developing countries to get financial assistance. But no worldwide treaty has as yet been produced that would manage to get binding commitments for all states. While the Kyoto Protocol, and this expired in 2012, while it tried, it was ultimately seen as a failure due to the fact that the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions were either not participating, the US, or had been exempted for a certain period of time, such as China, India, and others. Now, the latest iteration of international efforts to mitigate the harmful effects of human behavior on the environment can be found in the Paris Accord of 2015. It concluded with some promising pledges to reduce emissions, to develop green technology, and to assist the developing world in meeting its targets. However, neither mandatory cuts in emissions nor legally binding financial commitments were actually agreed upon in Paris. At none of the annual Conference of the Parties meetings, COP for short, since 2015 have states been able to finalize the rulebook with which they would lay out the details of how measures should be implemented. Notably, the states have not yet been able to come up with ways to regulate the carbon market, and thus each year the goal of finalizing the rulebook moves to the next meeting. At the same time, the annual financing efforts also continue to fall short. Every year the pledge has been repeated, and each year it falls short of the $100 billion. While some contributions have certainly been forthcoming, the OECD reports, for example, 58 billion were committed in 2016, 70 billion in 2017, but much of this is actually ad hoc. It's never guaranteed, and it thus makes it difficult for less developed countries to count on this kind of financing. Moreover, much of this comes with strings attached that makes the efforts much less sustaining than initially promised. All in all then, despite some aspirational goals and pledges, it is unlikely that the Paris Accord can lead to the necessary changes to avoid further devastating effects of climate change, especially considering that the US withdrew from the agreement and in light of the fact that global carbon emissions have been generally increasing. Even with a temporary reduction of emissions due to the COVID-19 crisis, it is now important to note that it's expected that by 2030, emissions will be higher than required to meet the agreed upon emissions reduction targets. So yes, there was a brief moment this year when, as you can see here, enormous reductions in emissions were reported. These were indeed the lowest ever reported emissions since 2006. But these were just for the first quarter of the year. Since then, economic activity has been restarted in many places around the world, and emissions have also started to creep back up. As the world returns to its slowly increasing pollution levels, the temporary reduction amounts to a drop in the ocean, says climate scientist Corinne Lacaire, who's at the University of East Anglia. It is clear that much more and more rapid action needs to be taken to push for more effective international efforts. It should not be surprising that at COP25 last year, Greta Thunberg, the Swedish climate activist you saw in the video, expressed her enormous frustration with the slow pace of these proceedings. And since the COVID-19 pandemic has moved COP26 from its planned November 2020 date to November 2021, the likelihood that the international community makes timely and substantive progress has further decreased. So where does this lead us? Well, it would be easy to simply end on this rather depressing note. And indeed, the current state of the world does not easily lend itself to even cautionary notes of optimism. And yet, even Greta Thunberg traveled to the UN to use her anger to shame policymakers into action, clearly indicating that she thinks change is still possible. Withdrawal is a complicated effort, and it takes a year to complete, which means that the US will officially leave the Paris deal on the 4th of November 2020, one day after the US election on the 3rd of November. But this actually seems to be counter to what most Americans favor this withdrawal. An October 2019 survey conducted by the Pew Research Center found that a large number of Americans favor action on the environment, and that, compared with a decade ago, more Americans say protecting the environment and dealing with global climate change should be top priorities for both the president and Congress. In fact, 64% say protecting the environment should be a top priority. 52% say the same about dealing with global climate change. Right? And these shares have grown considerably since 2011. However, it is important to point out that, as the report also finds, Republicans and Democrats differ over the effects of climate policies for the environment and for the economy. The same October 2019 survey said that 2/3 of Americans say the government wasn't doing enough to reduce the effects of global climate change. But there were wide political divides over the effects of climate policy. 70% of Democrats said policies aimed at reducing climate change generally provide net benefits for the environment. But if you compare that with only roughly a third of Republicans, then that means there is an enormously big difference. Instead, 43% of Republicans said such policies make no difference, and about 2 in 10, or 22%, said they do more harm than good for the environment. Indeed, Republicans see more risk than Democrats when it comes to the economic effects of climate policies. About half of Republicans said in 2019 that such policies hurt the economy. By contrast, most Democrats said climate policies either help or they make no difference to the economy. Now this, of course, this political divide is further complicated by the already devastating effects felt by the impact of the COVID-19 lockdown on the economy. But it also leads to a growing, albeit a rather slowly growing, recognition of further debilitating effects of climate change on the occurrence of pandemics and thus on the economy. And this, I would say, could actually provide a glimmer of hope. In other words, partisan differences notwithstanding, it is reassuring that millennial and younger Republicans are more likely than Republicans in the baby boomer or older generations to think government efforts to reduce climate change are insufficient. Right? So 52% of young people think it's insufficient, whereas it's only 31% of the older Republicans. GOP millennial adults are also less inclined than older Republican generations to prioritize fossil fuel development. For example, 78% of millennials say that the development of alternative energy sources should be a priority for the United States over the expansion of fossil fuel sources. And so this then to me means it is possible to at least focus on specific efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, even if concerted national or even international action might still be lagging behind. As your Great Decisions reading highlighted, the ability of the fossil fuel industry to leverage its economic size to halt or even reverse climate action is not to be trifled with. And at times of partisan strife, the winners of political struggles are often status quo interests. That, however, would spell long-term losses for everyone in terms of the devastating effects continued fossil fuel development would have on climate change. Recognizing that climate change action and specifically developments in alternative energy is seen as attainable and even desirable across the board by young people indicates that our challenge is to refocus our practical efforts, while of course hoping and maybe pushing policymakers to recognize that they are lagging behind the will of the people, certainly of young people. This is then how I would like to conclude, by pointing to research that shows that we do indeed have the tools to convert our economy to be ultimately fossil fuel free. For example, the International Energy Agency's 2019 report has found, and I quote, that renewable energy capacity is set to expand 50% between 2019 and 2024. It's led by solar energy. But the report also found that solar, wind, and hydropower projects are rolling out at their fastest rate in 4 years. As production goes up, so prices will go down, further increasing demand. And as the IEA's executive director notes, and I quote again, renewable energy will continue to rise in the upcoming decade, edging out fossil fuels and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And technologies such as solar and wind are at the heart of transformations taking place across the global energy system. Their increasing deployment is crucial for efforts to tackle greenhouse gas emissions, to reduce air pollution, and to expand energy access. Let's hope that these changes in thinking and the changes in technological adaptation will come fast enough to stop the increases in global temperatures from going above 2 degrees Celsius. We have the tools, and we just require the necessary political will. I would like to conclude properly by now thanking you very much for having gotten to the end of this presentation. And I would suggest that if you have comments or if you have any questions, that maybe you email them to me, and then I can respond with maybe a shorter recording just dealing with your questions or comments. Until the next time, I will leave you here with a little picture of me and my dog Max on our latest rather hot camping trip. All right, I hope you're all doing well. Best.